When my son Dimitri was 3 years old, he stopped making eye contact. He pretty much stopped speaking. In fact, he started communicating mostly by grunting and growling. So we went to the doctor. And my wife and I were told that our son was on the spectrum. Now, this was 15 years ago, so I had nodded my head and pretended that I knew what she was saying, but I had no clue what autism was. And when she said the word spectrum, my mind just flashed to my son space traveling to a galaxy far, far away. And then I heard Rod Serling in my head say, "Your son is traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of the mind. He's going to be taking a journey, a wondrous journey to a wondrous world called autism." I heard this doctor telling me my son was going to be living in the Twilight Zone. And I wasn't happy about it. But that's what I do. I try to make a joke out of something. All right? I try to hide how scared I am, like most people, say something witty, and get the laugh. So then about 6 months after that diagnosis and dealing with that, I'm having breakfast one morning, and I realize that my son Dimitri is eating his pancakes and reading the New York Times. But he's 4. And he looks like he's really reading the New York Times. A few weeks after that, he starts memorizing entire sections of movies and television shows that we're watching. And then he'll just spout them out randomly weeks later, getting it perfectly right. The most evident example of this was when I was taking him on the subway at rush hour, and a homeless guy got onto the train and said, "I'd like some money for my food and for my home," and all of a sudden, the little boy next to me stepped up and said, "Get off of our train!" Everybody froze. I was horrified. The doors opened, and the homeless man ran out. The strap hangers gave my son a standing ovation. I was horrified, and I said, "What are you doing? That was very mean." And he said, "That was in Ghost." And it was exactly from Ghost, and he used it in that way, which just kind of blew my mind, which also got us back to the doctor. And she posits that our son has Asperger's syndrome. Asperger is named after a Viennese pediatrician, Dr. Asperger, who did experiments on autistic orphans who he thought were high-functioning. His experiments came to an end when Hitler marched into Austria in 1938, put an end to that. But today, most parents know that Bill Gates has Asperger's, Einstein has Asperger's, so every parent, of course, wants that diagnosis for their child. I don't want an autistic kid, I want an Aspie. So, of course, in their infinite wisdom, the autism community said, no, that's no good, and they actually kind of removed that term from being used at all. But back in that doctor's office in 2003, I'm getting triggered by all these words. Asperger's, Hitler, what? Orphans, experiments. It was too much. My inner comic exploded, and this is what I do. I just started saying, Dr. Asperger, the Führer will see you now. And Dr. Asperger, perhaps you'd like to speak to Dr. Frankenstein. Maybe you have something in common. And while I was doing this, my poor wife at the time was in a corner trying to explain to the doctor that I was freaking out because I was scared about what was happening to our son, which was true. And the doctor was scared too because she knew that my wife and my son had to go home with me. The next bit of news that we got soon after that visit was that Dimitri was now diagnosed as hyperlexic. Turns out that autistics oftentimes are broken down into neurological categories. So autism with a mathematical slant, or strength in science, or gifted artist. And in my son's case, it was words and language, which was amazing. That meant that Dimitri actually saw words in his head. And it made perfect sense. This kind of explained the superhero thing about reading the New York Times. and how he memorized things. It also explained why he was delayed, right? Because when he heard conversation, he wasn't thinking response. He was bombarded with all the syntax and words flying around in his head. So in spite of my son biting people, in spite of him peeing in front of an entire school at recess, in spite of his tantrums at losing simple games like musical chairs, I actually saw him end a 6-year-old's birthday party because he didn't get a seat. In spite of his interesting sensory wiring, which was making him not be able to tell hot from cold, even if the water was scalding, which, if you're a distracted dad in charge at bath time, not good. It's an emergency room visit. So in spite of all these things, I had to look at the bright side. Because he was hyperlexic, he could read the New York Times and he could quote Fern Gully, an entire scene after just one viewing. This is good. Hyperlexia. My son's crazy about words. What is autism? Autism is from the Greek aut, or self, aftos, and then ism, which is a world. So my son preferred to be in his own world. What's wrong with that? I want to be in my own world. Again, find the joke, hide the fear, but it was true. I absolutely knew that making this kid laugh was the greatest feeling I had ever had. I knew how serious autism was, don't get me wrong. But making him laugh was, whose kid is that? He has my toes. All of those labelings and all of those therapies come down to one thing, from my opinion. Is your child a danger to himself or others? That's where parents have to really have faith. That's stepping off into thin air. Because no parent, no matter what the child, wants to believe that their child would want to hurt somebody, and especially not themselves. That's why this is beyond difficult. That's why this is actually painful. And a father has to fix things. So you see this happening in your son, and you're thinking, I have to fix it, I'm a dad. I have another son, my older son, Nikos. And when Nikos was a baby, he always had to be cuddled in order to fall asleep. And I was great at that job. That I could do. Dimitri, on the other hand, it was completely the opposite. He did not like to be touched, so hugging was a complete hazard to him. And if you know Greek people, we will hug postal workers and trees and anything that's around. So this poor kid, literally lived in a minefield. To him, gentle touch was painful, and intense touch was not a problem, which is terrifying when your son runs out of the woods after playing with a big gash in his leg and has no idea that he has a wound that's going to require 10 stitches. Back to the doctor. And this is how my mind worked. I was like, okay, this autism thing, it's not working out. Not good for us. So here's what we're going to do. I got some money. I have a lot of time. 24/7, we go at this thing, what? We can fix it 4 or 5 years, right? She was kind of over me by this point. And she just said, so here's the thing. There is nothing wrong with Dimitri. He is autistic. The wiring in his brain is different than the wiring in your brain. But in 4 or 5 years, maybe you can come to terms with that. Ouch. But no, I wasn't buying it. What I was going to do is I was going to lay down with Dimitri at night, every night, and read to him. And as his eyes fluttered and he started to go to sleep, I'd oh. And I put a hand on his shoulder, which woke him up instantly. But then I just kept doing it. Week after week, I had this ridiculous thing. I'd read to him, his eyes would flutter. If his eyes were shut long, I'd put a hand. Then I'd try to put an arm. I just did this over and over again until finally I check his breathing. His eyes have been closed for like 3 minutes. I have my arm around him. We are cuddling. I did it. Like, yay, I cured autism. And just as I'm exploding with joy, Dimitri's eyes snap open like in a horror film. And he looks at me and he goes, "You can go downstairs now." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "No, really. You can go now. I need to sleep." Oh my God. I remember backing out of the room thinking, wow, that was funny. And then I went downstairs and I cried my eyes out. You see, the doctor was right. D was fine. It was me that needed fixing. And I had to understand who my son was. So I needed to be aware of what he was all about. And that is an important part. That awareness leads to that understanding. What I understood was that he was getting, through this behavior of his, thrown out of every public school he ever attended. And when I watched what happened with the school's judgment, I realized they were making their decision based on his inappropriate behavior. The problem was they weren't taking into account how his mind worked. An example of it, the best example is, when Dimitri was in the 1st grade, he had a high school senior come to his class to talk about, I kid you not, the dangers of drugs to a 1st grade class. And this high school senior apparently had an extremely monotone voice, and she had a lot to say. And when she was finally finished with talking about the evils of huffing cleaning products and crack cocaine, most of the 1st graders were fast asleep. My son was wide awake. And she asked if there were any questions, and D was called on, and he said, had she ever considered next time bringing a 6-pack of beer because that was long? So now when this story is told to me in the principal's office, where I was called in the middle of the day, I burst out laughing. And the principal said, well, see, now maybe there's a connection. And I'm like, okay, fair enough, but maybe instead of making him feel bad, maybe he was funny. And maybe you need to look at that. And they said, yeah, maybe, but anyway, we got thrown out. And we moved a lot because of this. We had to find the right school, and finally we ended up 3,000 miles away back in California, and we found a school that had as its entire student body Dimitri's people. He finally went to a school with all autistic kids. He did not like it, but here's what happened. He still, even at that school, he got in trouble. But they didn't vilify my son. It wasn't that he was bad. They worked with how he thought. And the thing about Dimitri that's undeniable is that he is really funny. And they were able to use that. And then his mom and I convinced him, cajoled him, I threatened him, got him to go and join a teen improv comedy group at Second City. And he did that. And suddenly, his off-color observations were strengths, not weaknesses. He was being appreciated for his imagination and outside-the-box thinking. And that led to him acting. He tried acting. He's really very good. And both of those things just increased my son's confidence as a person. He started developing more eye contact. He started being better at socializing. And the best thing of all, he actually started to care about himself academically. So in high school, my autistic boy wanted to go to college. And I just went crazy. I was like, oh my God, he's going to go to college. So as he's approaching senior year, I'm like, hey, the narrative, you got to have a narrative, college application, essays. What's narrative? I go, hey, D, I'm a writer. I got a narrative. Okay, here it is, right? Teen saved by improv comedy from autism. And he literally said to me, you're playing the autism card too heavy. And I said, yeah, but if we tell them you're funny, you're like an amazing story. He's like, wouldn't talk to me. His older brother came to me and said, have you seen Dimitri's iPad? And I said, no. And he said, you need to take a look before you keep fighting with him about the narrative pitch of his essay. And I did. And what I saw was unbelievable drawings, lots and lots of drawings. I had no idea where these came from. I'm not a great father. I had no idea my son was drawing like this. I had to ask other people because I had no clue about it, and apparently he's got a talent. I mean, he's incredibly original. There's tons of work, and the best part is it really made him happy. But still, I panicked because I knew if I told colleges he was funny, he would get in. And he said, no, you are more invested in me being funny than I am. So, Dimitri did his own essay, did his own application, and just to show you an excerpt from his essay, you can show that a funny guy can't be unfunny. I've read all about your college, and being an individual with autism, I think it would be easy for me to fit in with the creative and eccentric students who go to your school. I mean this in the kindest way. Oh my God, I love that. So, today Dimitri is a freshman at Bard. And soon he will be deciding on being a studio art major and medieval history. I have no idea why. And if you push him, he will say, maybe I'll act because my father wants me to. If your daughter wants to play baseball, help her play ball. If your kid wants to draw, find out if he is drawing and help him. If they try to fight you about what they want, listen or don't. It doesn't matter because either way they're going to do what they want. And I think it's true of parenting any children, whether they're neurotypical or on the spectrum. It's really about staying out of their way. Help them find what they love, and usually they can take it from there. And the last thing, one additional thing, is if a family can laugh, believe me, the sky is the limit. Thank you.